Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. It's Sunday the 8th of June and my name is Brian Liddy. On the programme this week we're delighted to be joined by Paul McLennan, SNP MSP for East Lothian and the Scottish Government Housing Minister. Good afternoon, Paul, how are you?
I'm not bad, thanks, Brian. Yourself?
Fine, thank you. And we're also delighted to welcome Councillor Mark Hooper. He's Plaid Cymru's #1 candidate for the Bridgend Vale of Glamorgan constituency in next year's Senedd elections in Wales. Good afternoon, Mark. It's your first time, so thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for the invite. Looking forward to this session. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Sadly, we're going to start with today's Middle East update. At least 54,772 Palestinians have been killed and 125,834 people have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. As the Israel and US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation says it will reopen 2 of its aid points today, after distributing no desperately needed food in Gaza yesterday, there are reports that over 100 people have been killed by Israeli fire while seeking aid at its location since May 27th. Paul, that is probably the briefest ever Gaza Middle East update. Have you any more to add?
Brian, what I suppose surprises me in some ways and surprises me not in other ways is in terms of just how much this has been normalised now. Almost daily we're seeing atrocities from Gaza, and almost daily we see very little response from the UK government or the US government in terms of this. I just find it unbelievable that this is allowed to continue to go on. Both the UK and the US still continue to sell arms to Israel to commit the crimes that they're doing, and it's genocide. There's no doubt about it. In terms of this, I just wish that we would see the UK government and US government take a much stronger position with Israel on this. If not, they will continue to do what they're doing.
Thank you, Paul. And Mark, I don't know if you know, but we always start off the show with either a Ukraine or Gaza update. We do both. But is there anything that you'd like to contribute about Gaza?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Paul just said. I don't think there's anything to disagree there. But I think the thing that's most interesting, and I think we're probably going to come on to it later, is that when Trump won the presidency, he said he sorted these problems out within a day. And it just shows the weakness of the position and potentially the power of the lobbying that goes on in both the UK government and clearly in the US government to keep these things as they are. You know, this is a atrocity that's continuing. I think it's continuing in, broad daylight. We're all seeing it. But Paul makes a really interesting point, is that people are almost becoming desensitized to how horrific this issue is. And I think that in and of itself is awful. So I think it's really important that broadcasters like yourselves put this front and center. It's the same with Ukraine, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in a minute. But people need to realize that these are real innocent people who are losing their lives daily. And, we're part of a government that frankly isn't doing anything to stop it and are doing things to continue it. The continuation of the sale of arms is an abomination on the UK, and it should be called out.
Thank you, Mark. And now moving on to today's Ukraine update. Vladimir Putin's threatened retaliation against Ukraine over its drone attack on Russia's bomber fleet has not happened yet in earnest, despite heavy bombardment of Kharkiv and Kyiv in the past 2 days, and is likely to be a significant multi-pronged strike soon, US officials have said. One senior Western diplomat anticipated a huge, vicious and unrelenting assault by Moscow. Michael Kaufman, a Russia expert at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, said Russia might seek to punish Ukraine's SBU domestic security agency, which orchestrated last weekend's assault, possibly employing intermediate-range ballistic missiles, as well as targeting defence manufacturing sites. Kaufman did consider that Russia's options for retaliation may be limited, as it was already throwing a lot of its military might at Ukraine. Ukrainian drone attack called Operation Spiderweb is being reported to have damaged about 10% of Russian strategic bomber fleet and hit some of the aircraft as they were being prepared for strikes on Ukraine, according to a German military assessment. Major General Christian Freuding told a YouTube podcast that more than a dozen aircraft were damaged, Tu-95 and Tu-22 strategic bombers as well as A-50 surveillance planes. He said only a handful of the A-50s exist and can now no longer be used for spare parts. Despite the losses, Freuding did not see any immediate reduction of Russian strikes against Ukraine, noting that Moscow retained 90% of its strategic bombers, which can launch ballistic and cruise missiles in addition to dropping bombs, but pointed out that there is an indirect effect as the remaining planes will need to fly more sorties, increasing damage and maintenance risks, and he also pointed to the huge psychological impact of the Ukrainian strike. Freuding said Russia had felt safe in its vast territory, which also explained why there was little protection for the aircraft. After this successful operation, this no longer holds true. Russia will need to ramp up the security measures, Freuding said. Ukraine's Foreign Minister, Andriy Sybiha, said Russia had responded to its destroyed aircraft by attacking civilians in Ukraine, multi-storey buildings were hit, and energy infrastructure damaged. Russian strikes on the Ukrainian cities of Kherson and Kharkiv early on Saturday killed at least 5 people, officials said. Russia hit Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, with missiles, Shahid drones and guided bombs before dawn on Saturday, killing 3 people in what the mayor, Igor Terekhov, described as the most powerful attack there since the start of the war. Russia's missile and drone barrage against Kyiv on Friday killed at least 7 people, Ukrainian officials said. 2 died in an attack on the northern city of Chernihiv and 2 more in the northwestern city of Lutsk. 80 people were injured in attacks across Ukraine on Friday. Russia and Ukraine have accused each other of thwarting a large-scale prisoner exchange that was agreed in the last week, with Kyiv denying Russian allegations that it had indefinitely postponed prisoner swaps, while accusing Moscow of playing dirty games. At talks in Istanbul on Monday, Kyiv and Moscow agreed to release more than 1,000 people on each side, while Russia said it would also hand back the remains of 6,000 killed Ukrainian soldiers. Mark, I'm going to come to you first on this one. I think this huge attack by Ukraine on Russia was probably taking place when we were live on air last week. It's apparently the furthest away place that was hit by Ukraine was an airbase which is closer to Japan than it is to the Ukraine. It was about 3,500 miles away. I don't know. So what's your thoughts then on the war in Ukraine, but maybe more specifically this incredible attack, this audacious attack it's been called?
Yeah, I was going to use the word audacious. I think that probably describes it and sums it up really, really well. But also a well-planned attack. I think in the reports subsequent to it, they were saying this was a plan that was in preparation for about 18 months, which I think says quite a lot of it. But again, it also talks to the length of time that this war has been happening, and it's almost we forget that this is happening in the mainland of Europe to people who are not dissimilar to ourselves. That the Ukraine is predominantly, essentially, in large parts, a Western European country in the way that they lived their lives, and now, 2 of the major cities you just described have been under attack from missiles and drone attacks, which must be absolutely frightening. Occasionally you hear a drone in the air taking photos in Barry or wherever we are in Scotland, and you think to yourself, well, what would that feel like if it was an attack drone? So I think these are hugely scary times, and I think it talks to the need for us to not rely on strongmen tactics, like Trump saying I can sort this out with Putin in 24 hours. Clearly couldn't, but more about the international rules to be able to solve this, and there needs to be an immediate ceasefire, and the European allies need to work together. So UK needs to play its part in making sure that we force Russia to the table, but Ukraine need to be in there and be able to have their say in what goes on, because you can't have a brokerage of the way this thing will be resolved by the US without actually taking account of what Ukraine needs. So I think we're in it's an awfully sad time. It's 3 years in and hugely dangerous.
Thank you, Mark. Paul, these Ukrainian drones only cost a couple of £100 each, but they took out military equipment that's cost billions of dollars. Has this totally changed the face of warfare?
I think, first of all, it exposes the weakness of Russia's defence, I suppose, sector at the moment. I think that's shown that. I think in terms of, as you said, I mean, that was an audacious attack. I think drones and how drones are used in warfare, I think will continue to change in a strategic review of Britain. I think that's something that's going to have to be a never-increasing part of how you tackle warfare. I think it also exposes just the total lack of Donald Trump's approach. He flip-flops all over the place. He's erratic in terms of what he's saying. 1 minute, Zelensky's the cause of the war. The next minute, it's Putin, and Trump's just all over the place. So there's no pressure on Putin to stop the war from Donald Trump. It's sanctions, heavy sanctions against the Russians in terms of that. That's not happening. Again, it exposes that. And we're right, Mark's right, in terms of talking about the European response to this has to be trying to drive forward in terms of this. So Putin has no pressure on him to stop the war. He'll continue to do what he does. And we're all expecting, as you said, that multi-pronged attack now that Putin promised in terms of this. So it highlights Russia's weakness. It exposes Trump's just nonsensical approach to try and diplomacy, not just in this issue, but in other issues as well. And you don't see any pressure on Putin to stop this war whatsoever.
Paul, it's not a great line. You're breaking up quite a lot there, but I think we're getting the gist of what you're saying. I don't know. Hopefully it's going to improve as we go on. So in the past week, we've had the richest man in the world and the most powerful man in the world fighting in the street, metaphorically speaking. I think Trump made an analogy last week about the Russian war in Ukraine, and he said it was like two kids scrapping in a park. And yet, with no sense of irony, this week has seen two so-called grown men, Trump and Musk, both in positions of power and authority, both potentially figures that are to be held in high regard, and someone for children to look up to. And yet they've been squabbling and trading insults in public. Paul, have you been following the Trump-Musk spat? Oh, I think maybe the line might be down. Can you hear us, Paul? Mark, maybe you can fill in for Paul while we work out whatever kind of technical issue we've got.
Yes, it's probably Elon now just getting in the way of our connection so that we don't criticise him, because the two of these, they've been behaving like absolute children, and yet one of them, as you say, the richest man in the world, and the other one arguably is the most powerful man in the world. I think it's just, it should be no surprise. I think anyone who's seen Trump in his first term would have realised that he would fall out with himself, given half a chance. And you look at it and you just think, well, they're all going to do the same. But we're seeing the same thing in the UK. You've seen Reform, Zia Youssef resign and then 2 days later come back, and people like Aaron Banks saying there's going to be champagne corks popping because Youssef has gone. And you see all of these things come from the same place. These people they're very much creatures who've found need to work together for no real change reason, but just it suits their own purposes. And it was always going to be, a box of frogs moment. But I think we're just surprised how quickly this thing escalated. And it went from, if it was going to be a schoolyard fight, it went from calling someone names to a full-on brawl within about 20 minutes. It was mad.
Thank you, Mark. I believe Paul's trying to reconnect and hopefully we'll come up with a better connection. So again, Mark, if you don't mind, in his absence, I'm sorry, it's your first show and you're taking the full brunt of all the questions. This all started, this spat started on when Elon Musk, the former head of Doge, waded in on the best thing since sliced bread, according to Trump, which is Trump's one big beautiful bill, the aim of which is to give a £664 billion tax break to the richest 1% of Americans. That would include Musk, of course. It's going to throw 13.7 million people off of Medicaid and cut $290 billion from programmes that feed the hungry. I don't know, but for me the most staggering thing is that this is all being conducted live in public on social media. Some of the exchanges are only taking place 5-10 minutes apart. It's then it's the first item on the Friday night BBC News national news. It's like, it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's incredulous, isn't it? It is something you just can't believe that this is happening. It's also happening on their own platforms as well. So Trump is using Truth Social. I've never been on Truth Social, never intend to. And Musk is using his own platform, Twitter, or as he likes to call it, X these days. So they're both battling each other on platforms they own and platforms that they can't, it sounds like we've got Paul back as well, which is good news. But it's one of those things, this is completely mad. But we say that, and yet this guy, Trump, is managing to have an argument with somebody in plain sight, and next to him, whether he's sitting there in his bedroom playing, on his phone doing these things, and next to him are the nuclear codes from the States. So huge power in somebody who, to my book, is incapable of exercising judgment well, which is, for the world, hugely scary.
Thank you, Mark. Paul, you've probably we've been talking about the richest man in the world and the most powerful man in the world having a public cat fight on social media. I wonder if, I don't know if you know, but it's official that Trump 2028 hats have gone into production. In fact, they're probably already available in all good American stores as we speak. I'm guessing that they're probably going to be red and baseball ball style caps. But with that obviously means that Trump's eyeing up a third term, which is unconstitutional unless it's a time of war. Can the US survive the assault on its democracy since Trump came to power?
I think it's an extremely worrying time, and apologies for being cut off there. I think it's an extremely worrying time. I think before the election there was always a talk of the 2025 project that Trump was talking about, which included a third run, which, as you said, is unconstitutional. The spat with Elon Musk is indicative of Trump's, I suppose, behaviour since he's come into power. The way that he tried to embarrass Vladimir Zelensky, the way that he tried to do that with the South African president as well, sort of Ramaphosa. His behaviour is erratic at the best in terms of this. But I think, as Mark said, this is a man that's got his finger on the nuclear button. This is a man that can make Americans poorer, again, through his policies in terms of this. And again, just looking at his, I suppose, the way he handled the tariffs issue, again, is very much indicative of where he is. And again, if that doesn't go his way, he'll start blaming the courts, never mind the Constitution. So you can see the discussion going on about 2028 where he'll blame the courts and try to change the Constitution. So it is, you're almost in a semi-dictatorship at the moment, and that's extremely worrying, I think, in terms of this. But it's indicative of where the man's behaviours are. Nothing ever surprises me around about the way Donald Trump behaves, never. And this is just indicative of doing that. You're talking about two very, very powerful men having an immature discussion that you would expect teenagers to have. It's a crazy situation, but nothing ever surprises, I think, anybody anymore with Donald Trump's behaviour.
Thank you, Paul. And your line is much clearer now, so thank you for doing that. So the SNP lost the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election to Labour. With 54% support for independence in Scotland, the SNP should have won. So what went wrong? Paul, I mean, I suppose maybe I should just come to you and ask you simply that. What did go wrong?
I, I think there's a number of things, and I think it's time for cool heads at the moment. Obviously, you've seen the reaction since Thursday. I was through there on a number of occasions. Didn't see this coming at all. Wasn't picking up any Labour vote, any strong Labour vote at all. Labour, I think, had a very poor candidate in terms of this. I know they said he was local, but in terms of his, I suppose, performance in interviews, his lack of knowledge was very poor. I think there's a couple of things. One is obviously, I think, from where the constituency was before, there was a low level of canvassing had been carried out. And again, that's something I think the party needs to learn of if we're moving towards 2026, is that the strong level of canvassing needs to be obtained in every single constituency before then, because it's all about trying to get out your vote and maximising that. And now, I can't talk for the Labour Party machine in terms of this. I think in terms of the messaging, it was very much looking at local issues. In terms of this, I know there was a focus on, for example, garden waste charges, which was a little part of it, but a lot of the key things was obviously talking around about the additional appointments around for the NHS, and so on. So, and I think one of the key things that we all have to ask, I mean, you will see support for independence in the last poll was at 54%. Yes, seem to have a sustained lead now in the polls from all pollsters. And yet we're seeing the SNP achieving 29% in the election there. Now, one, I suppose, thing, can almost have a point of caution is, and again, this is where John Curtis had a look at this, and Kenny said he expected the result to be very close based on where the recent polling was. So didn't see it as an indicative, an indication that Labour would obviously be in a much stronger position than it would be previously for 2026. But it damages momentum. If the SNP had won it, there would have been momentum building up in that. So I think it'll take cool heads. I think there's a few things we need to look at. One is around about delivery. What is the Scottish Government doing in terms of where it is just now, and both in terms of the NHS, in terms of housing in my own area, and in terms of the cost of living crisis. Now, cost of living and NHS are the two biggest issues that consistently come through. So, is the party doing enough on that? Does it need to refocus its delivery on that? Does it need to look at what it needs to say going forward to elections? It's very clear that Labour have let the country down in Scotland and in Wales, of course, and in the rest of the UK in terms of the two-child cap, the winter fuel allowance, WASPy women, and so on. So I think it needs cool heads. It's a surprising result, but it's something I think we have to try and obviously move on and work with at pace before 2026.
Paul, I'll stay with you for the time being, if you don't mind. A lot of commentators have been saying it's easy to say in aftersight as well, isn't it? But they said that maybe the decision by the SNP to stop hammering Labour, assuming that Labour was finished, and then starting to go for reform was a mistake. I'm kind of thinking it's like when you're a kid and you're told not to go near what you think are dead fireworks because they might still be live. So do you think maybe in hindsight you should have kept hammering Labour rather than give reform oxygen?
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I seen some of the canvassing when we were out. It was clear there was a strong reform vote out there. I think that was one thing. I think it didn't pick up how strong Labour were performing. Generally, didn't pick that up. However, I mean that's something didn't in terms of looking at the canvas. I think that may have been guided by that. For me, it's very much. And I suppose maybe the key thing I think for me it's very much if you go into an election, and I've always thought this since being a councillor in 2007 to where I am now, it's giving people reasons to vote for the SNP, not against reform, not against Labour. I think it's very much trying to say to people, these are the reasons why you should be voting for the SNP. Was it a slightly negative campaign? Possibly. Was it the message should have been more focused on what the SNP are doing and what the SNP almost in compare and contrast kind of with reform and Labour? Possibly. Was there I suppose a mixed message? People might have seen it that way in terms of this, but I'd much preferred if we'd had a more focused campaign in terms of what the SNP are doing just now, their record of delivery, and obviously looking towards 2026 and in terms of that. So was it a mixed message? I think that's something the party will have to reflect on in the next few days and weeks, as it takes time just to take stock and as we prepare for 2026. All of us now are starting to campaign for 2026 in terms of that. So we'll wait and see what the party says. I think it's something that will be discussed within the MSP group, but also within campaigns going forward.
Thank you, Paul. So, Mark, you're in Plaid Cymru and you're standing for election. Is this a by-election that you've been following closely? And if so, are there any lessons that you would want to take away from it?
Well, I'm going to be a little bit more positive than Paul in some ways, because I think the momentum is still with the SNP, even in the constituency, despite having lost. Because if you look at the seat at the general election, Labour won that with a significantly bigger majority. So I think there's perspectives. I've stood in elections and lost, and you always look back and you think to yourself, what could we have done differently? And I can hear that being played out in the SNP. In Wales, we're in an interesting place because obviously we've had a Labour government for 26 years. For most of that time, they've been able to go, the Tories have let us down and letting Wales down, and it's only them who are standing up for Wales. And we're now seeing that argument falling flat on its face, because we've got, consistently used a phrase that there's the power at both ends of the M4, the motorway that leads from London to Cardiff, and they are both working together for the benefits of the people of Wales. And when you see things, and Paul's already trotted them out, the winter fuel payment, the PIP changes, WASPy women, etc., 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 then you see people feel let down. And only last week we found out that there was a railway line between Oxford and Cambridge, which for anyone whose needs reminding is nowhere near Wales, has been classified as an England-Wales project, which means that we don't get any Barnett consequentials for that piece. You can just sense that things are wrong in the mix, and those are things that we're seeing some genuine movement in people going, well, actually, I've heard enough from Labour saying they were standing up, and now they've had the opportunity to make real change. It's all going the wrong way. So yeah, and as Paul said, the campaigns have started. We're in campaign mode now for 2026, and I think that it's just how do you maintain the conversations that allow people to truly challenge the things that they've been told before are true and clearly aren't.
Thank you, Mark. Paul, I think it's worth noting that Alba didn't field a candidate in this by-election out of respect for the SNP's Christine McKelvey, because of her important contributions to the independence movement, they said. And she held that seat for 3 times in a row, three elections in a row. What did Christina McKelvey have, do you think, that the SNP candidates don't have at the moment? Or has something changed in the constituency since Christina McKelvey last won the seat?
I think there's a number of things. First of all, we all miss Christina. Christina was an incredibly vibrant person, and I'm talking as an individual, not just as an MSP. We were all deeply saddened when Christina passed away. She knew the area very well. She, regardless whether people supported her or not, was very vociferous in terms of support for the constituency. I think there's one thing I agree with Mark as well. It's not trying to read too much into a by-election. Also, in terms of this, Labour nearly won 50% of the vote in the election, the UK general election, in terms of that as well. So I think that's one part of it. I think it's not trying to read too much into a specific by-election. I think in terms of the key thing, obviously, is the influence of reform and where a reform going to do. Now, the reform vote was up, the SNP vote was down. I don't think there was a huge amount of votes went from the SNP to reform in previous by-elections, and polling has indicated that as well. So I think we've got to be very careful what we take out of that. And I think when you're looking at John Curtis's analysis of it, I think it's quite balanced. It does say, that he still thinks the SNP is in prime position still to win the election in 2026. But we have to put our case out there for another term in terms of people. It's always difficult for governments that have been in for as long a period of time as we have, as against the Labour government, But Labour government coming in, as Marcus said, hasn't performed at all. It's letting people down. And one of the key things I think for me, and I just said prior to the show, I was down in Cardiff last week, and we were speaking to Welsh Government colleagues. So primarily it was talking about Grenfell and so on, but we got on talking around about some of the powers to tackle poverty. And the Welsh Government itself knows it doesn't have the powers to tackle poverty as well as it possibly could do. We don't have sufficient powers in the Scottish Parliament to do that as well. There's too many levers still in the UK still to deal with that. So even Labour governments in Wales, for example, know the limitations of devolution, and I think that's why we're seeing support for Plaid Cymru growing in Wales, and I think that's why we've seen the latest opinion poll in Wales showing Plaid ahead with Labour and third. So we've got to continue to push that message. Devolution doesn't work for the people of Scotland. It doesn't work for the people of Wales. And only independence in Scotland and Wales is going to give the real powers for us to tackle poverty and grow our economies. And just as Mark had said, the decision around about I suppose the comments around about trying to, I think that Mark made around about trying to classify some of the funding in England as benefits for Wales it's a ridiculous position to be in. So we've got to focus on the fundamentals in terms of that as we continue to go forward.
Thank you, Paul. So the Chancellor's Rachel Reeves is going to announce our spending review on Wednesday. There have been calls for Chancellor Reeves' UK spending review to abandon welfare cuts and prioritise growth instead. Finance Secretary here in Edinburgh, Shona Robeson, said the UK spending review is an opportunity for the government to abandon some of its damaging policies, such as cuts to welfare, support for disabled people, to scrap the two-child benefit cap and to reinstate universal winter fuel payments. She said they're also aware of the huge impact of the increase of employers' national insurance, at least on the public services, and she said that the spending review should empower devolved administrations. Mark, it's no surprise maybe that a Scottish minister is going to be critical of Rachel Reeves' spending review even before we've heard what's going to be in it. In Wales, in the Senate, you've got a Labour government, and your First Minister, Eleanor Morgan's been critical of her colleagues in Westminster. So do you think you're going to get similar statements coming out of the Senate before the review?
No. So Eluned's criticism is as a result of the poll you just mentioned that put Plaid Cymru on 30% and Rhys Iorwerth being First Minister in 2026. So it was a reaction to the change in circumstances that Eluned decided to think her only option now is to start to be critical of the UK government. But she's not doing it in any way that changes their minds. So we've got a spending review that's going to increase some capital spending, which should be good and welcomed. But it reduces revenue spend in areas where the poorest people in our societies across England, Wales and Scotland clearly are going to be hit hardest. And when those services get diminished, and that includes things like local government and others, it really will have an impact on people. And I think you've got a situation now where it's clear, and I think you've mentioned some of them, where the emphasis should be. Paul's talked about poverty, and the easiest way to take the most children out of poverty today is to end the two-child cap. So one of the things that we've been calling for, and I'm sure it's the same in Scotland, is an end to the two-child cap immediately. Now, there's costs associated with that, but the thing that really, boils my blood, I think, is a polite way of describing it, is the way that some people in the Labour Party in the UK government are seeing this as a political opportunity to consider. You said people still, agree with a two-child cap. Children are being born into poverty is an absolute abomination on our society and should be changed. So there are things that they should do and happen quickly. I've already mentioned the issue about the Oxford and Cambridge railway line, but there's still, when Labour were in spending their time criticising the Conservative government from the Senate, they said that we needed the HS2 consequentials of over £4 billion. Now they're in government, they're in the hundreds of millions, they're saying was the difference. So that's an example of how people like Leonard Morgan and others change their mind when they've got the people in power. That needs to be changed immediately. So I think there's things that we'll be looking for, which we are not hopeful of seeing, which would, frankly, again, it's a message to the Welsh people and to those people. There's the way that the Labour government in Westminster consider our country is not in a way that solves the problems that are deeply embedded in our country. And again, like Paul, the route to this, in my view, and has been for a long time now, is independence. And that won't be easy, but at least we'll be responsible for ourselves and start to move these things forward.
Thank you, Mark. And when it comes to things like the Oxford, Cambridge and HS2, we feel your pain here in Scotland, and we really do. Paul, this kind of reminds me of like when there's a budget in Westminster and Holyrood can't publish its budget until after Westminster has published their budget. And I guess spending reviews are the same thing. You probably can't really say anything until you find out what's going to be in the spending review. It's that kind of like relationship. But you're in cabinet alongside Shona Robertson, and do you think is Rachel Reeves seriously going to listen to Shona Robertson and make any changes to her spending review on Wednesday?
I would hope so, but I have severe doubts that the UK government will do that. The Welsh government and Scottish government and the countries themselves are just an afterthought. They won't come in terms of this. And I think there's a couple of things I think the Scottish government's talking about. One is obviously is a 2-child cap. The Scottish government are already taking measures to try and abolish that in terms of where they are. So we'll see what kind of comes out of that. I don't think they'll take anything on that. The winter fuel allowance and the discussions around about that, again, it's ridiculous the way that the UK government's doing something about it. We're going to mitigate it, they say, but they can't tell anybody any details on how it's going to be qualifying in terms of this. I think there's a number of key things. I think there's a precursor that they want to increase funding on the NHS. And I think that's been obviously touted in the last few days. But where are the cuts going to come from? Will the Scottish and Welsh government's budgets be cut? I would probably assume so. I think one of the key things we've been asking for as well, and there's a few things. One is obviously about multi-year spending. We only get a budget year by year by year. It doesn't give us ability to plan ahead more than in 1 year, and how we support our charities and other stakeholders in terms of that. So multi-year fund and any announcements around about that would be very welcome, because again, that's something that impacts on us. And the UK government needs to be doing more to tackle poverty. It's as simple as that, and the cost of living crisis. So we'll see what kind of comes out of that. Scotland has been an afterthought. There's no proper consultation with the Scottish government on this particular matter in regards to that. So we'll see. I think it's again been touted that the NHS will get additional monies, but other departments will suffer because of that. And we'll wait and see once we have the announcement during the week and exactly how that impacts in Scotland. I'm not expecting a positive outcome from this. I think when you looked at the situation about the potential black hole that was mentioned, the Labour government a year ago almost ignored that. I've always been a believer of progressive taxation. If people want better services in lots of ways, we need to be looking at, again, how we pay for that. And again, I think that's something that the UK government has probably moved away from in the last year or so, and even more so. So we'll wait and see where it goes. I don't expect anything around about progressive taxation to come through in this spending review either.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for mentioning mitigation. Mitigation and Barnett consequentials, I think, are always an interesting sort of seesaw. Mark, I don't know if you caught Keir Starmer using Govan here in Glasgow last week, just before the by-election, and he announced what's been described as a warfare, not welfare approach. Do you think, is that going to be a clue as to what's going to be in Rachel Reeves' spending review on Wednesday?
I think it is to some extent, but it also, we've had this was coming down the line a long time ago, and it feels like one of those things that's hugely sad that we find it easier to find the money to spend on bombs, bullets, and tanks, and less to spend on child poverty. And it's, again, it's one of those things that just it worries me that we're having a society that is broken in some areas and we've got no way of solving it. So this concerns me. It's concerned me for a long time. I think it's very easy to get wrapped up in this protection of the realm. I think he described it as well, which was is an interesting phrase in and of itself. But I think there are other issues that need solving, and they need solving quickly. But I think this whole context of how do you make these things work, and again, it's unsurprising that we are agreeing with our sister party in the SNP here in this regard. It's about making sure those people with the deepest pockets pay properly, because they don't. And if we want decent and well-funded services, then we need to tax properly to make that happen as well. But I can't see that fitting into Reeves's spending review at all, because it's not on their agenda. They're more concerned about keeping their mates in the City of London happy and the bond traders happy than they are the children who are in poverty, not just in England, but also in Scotland and Wales, who are completely forgotten about.
Thank you, Mark. Paul, this spending review, is it like a budget in Westminster? Do you have a spending review to kind of adjust things once Rachel Reeves has announced her spending review? Do you respond to it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Scottish Government sets its budget. It also tries to set its medium-term financial strategy in terms of, so it's not a spending review as such, but it's something that we have to obviously base on in terms of there's no real discussion with the Scottish Government nor the Welsh Government on this particular point. It's something obviously when they're looking at their spending review, and again it depends on how long at a timescale they're looking at. If they're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then obviously it'll impact on that. There will be modelling that will be carried out, and that's something that we'll have to then, I suppose, reassess after that kind of comes through. So again, it doesn't fit in with our budget process at all in terms of this. So again, there'll be analysis carried out by colleagues and the finance teams during the week and see what impact it has on Scotland in terms of that. So it will impact on Scottish Government, and there's no doubt whatsoever in terms of this. And again, that's something that will be part of our medium-term financial strategy as we kind of go forward in terms of that as well. So, as I said, one of the most frustrating things is there's no consultation with the Scottish Government on this matter whatsoever, with the devolved administrations whatsoever. So we, once again, it comes back and exposes the failures of devolution. In terms of this, we need independence to make our own decisions to suit our own country. In terms of what we need to do to tackle poverty, address the cost of living crisis, which I said people are seeing as the most pressing issues at the moment. But time will tell. So let's wait and see what kind of comes Wednesday, but not expecting good news.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So when Keir Starmer got into Number 10 and said that he was going to reset the relationship with the devolved parliaments, was he disingenuous when he said that, or he just hasn't gotten round to it yet, or what do you think?
I think, to be honest, having had to deal previously with Conservative government ministers, even getting a reply was genuinely, even getting a reply was very difficult. There's more discussions, I have to say, with the UK government on that particular matter. We had, when I was down in Wales last week, we had a good discussion around about Grenfell, for example, and how closely we can work on Grenfell. So there's probably been I suppose the relations have warmed up a little bit in terms of that, but in terms of the fundamentals and how they see, and Mark touched on it, about how they see Wales and how they see Scotland. Wales and Scotland are still afterthoughts. There is no doubt about that whatsoever. So relations have improved, but the fundamentals have not changed. The fundamentals will never change, because Westminster is never going to be the best way of government going forward for Wales or Scotland in lots of ways. It doesn't allow us the progressive policies that we need to tackle the issues that's facing us just now. As I said, primarily looking at poverty and the cost of living crisis and growing our economies in terms of that as well. So yes, have improved, but not the fundamentals.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So the Scottish Government, forgive me while I just line something up here, the Scottish Government introduced the Housing Scotland Bill to the Scottish Parliament last year with the aim of tackling poverty by improving the experience of renters and hopefully preventing homelessness. Included within the Housing Bill is OWAB's law, named after 2-year-old Owab Ishak, who died in 2020 following prolonged exposure to damp and mould in his home in Rochdale. And the Scotland Bill, which is going to include, as I said, an Owab law, has just passed its stage 2 scrutiny in Holyrood. And Paul, I understand that this is your bill. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think there's a number of things, Brian, when it comes to that. I think there was two key issues. One was around about prevention duties, in terms of how do we prevent homelessness in the first place. So we worked very closely, obviously, with Crisis and other stakeholders in terms of that. And one of the fundamental things is Ask and Act. So it brings legal duties on to other stakeholders in terms of how they ask about homelessness, potential homelessness, and how they act upon that. And it's not just local authorities. So how do we work, for example, we've done a lot of work with the prison service, so people coming out of prison, in terms of that. Care leavers, we've done a lot of work with the care leavers sector as well. And obviously people working very closely with the NHS as well. And you'll find that people in homelessness have many diverse issues. Now, that might be mental health, that could be in terms of substance abuse, that might be in terms of domestic abuse. 25% of women who end up in homelessness suffer domestic abuse. So it's trying to strengthen the measures around about that. So there was a lot of work in terms of that, and renters' rights, as you said, in terms of that. So, for example, AWAB's law and how we tackle damp and mould, and the tragic case of Awab Ishak, as you said. So again, we've worked very closely with stakeholders on that. The second part of the bill, obviously, was around about rent controls. And I'm proud in Scotland we can be bringing forward rent controls to tackle issues as well. Now, that work will obviously continue to go on as we work with local authorities where there are rent pressures in Edinburgh and Glasgow, for example. So, but it also allows the ability as well, and we're very keen to do that, to allow investment into the sector as well. So we will be launching our House Investment Task Force report, which brought together stakeholders from the likes of the Scottish National Investment Bank, Scottish Future Trust, local authorities, housing associations, institutional investors as well, about how we can get money into housing as well. So it's tried to achieve these objectives of rent controls, renters' rights, and also in terms of prevention duties as well. So I think it's a good bill going through. Stage 3 will be coming up after summer recess, and I think it's a major step forward for housing in Scotland.
Thank you, Paul. And Mark, I know that there's a homelessness and social housing allocation Wales bill going through the Senate at the moment. If passed, have you any idea how is that going to compare with? There's also a Westminster bill as well, by the way, on something similar. How do you think the Welsh version is going to compare between the Westminster and Holyrood ones?
So I don't think it's as ambitious as Paul's bill, which we commend, and we look at this as a way of building our manifesto for the 26th election as well. We're working on a lot of work on housing because it's so important. It talks to a lot of the issues we've got in society. It talks to health issues, talks to mental health issues. It talks to just a feeling of security, of people feeling that they can build their lives and economic growth as well. So I think there's lots of things that need to be solved with housing. And it's one of those things, some places, I think it was Finland, where they talk about housing first being the response to issues. And I think it's something that fits very much with what we're trying to do. We'll be looking in the next Senate to enshrine the right to adequate housing as being a legal duty on government to provide. So it's not just something that becomes an aspirational view. It's something that the public in Wales have an absolute right to adequate housing because it's so important. Now, how do we move this forward? I worked for a short while last year as part of the cooperation agreement as a special advisor within Welsh Government, trying to establish a route to improve housing supply. And I think there's lots of opportunities for us to do things that cross over other areas, like making sure we embed carbon into our housing stock that we build, making sure that we actually build houses, council houses, at a rate that the demand requires. Because at the moment, and I think this again talks to Paul's bill, the need for rent controls is absolutely key, because the private rented sector is costing a lot of people more than they can afford, and then that leads to poverty in other ways, whilst wealth continues to extract out of our communities. And even if that's wealth to, local landlords, it still takes it away from the poorest in our society and transfers it to those who are richer. So I think there's a lot more in this bill. Commend Paul on getting it to this point, and look forward to seeing improvements in Scotland that we can emulate as well. But you also talked about the UK government putting a bill in place, which actually talks again to these things that it's very difficult to solve all of these problems when you've got competing legislators working at different angles. This is so important. We need to be working together on this. And, maybe, again, to repeat a line that's been used a number of times in this programme today, it's very, very difficult to see how that you can solve all these things without all the levers of power in your hand.
Thank you, Mark.
But Brian, just on that, I think there's another couple of points to mention. I think the housing bill is a big step forward in terms of that, but there are still levers that the UK government holds. For example, I can't go out and borrow capital like any other country in Europe can go out to borrow capital for building houses. We get what we're given from the UK government. And one of the biggest issues as well, and this was part of an independent report carried out by Crisis, working in conjunction with Heriot University, the biggest, I suppose, contributors to homelessness in Scotland. This was an independent report, was the low level of local housing allowance, which is far too low, was frozen previously by the UK government, the Tory UK government, and Labour increased it last year, but are going to freeze it again this year. It's far too low, and the low level of universal credit as well. So, we've been contacting the UK government on this particular issue on a number of occasions about local housing allowance. That is the biggest contributor to homelessness. We don't have the ability to do anything about that again, so it exposes the frailties, it exposes the shortcomings of devolution in terms of that. And again, if you're talking about the local housing allowance, your housing benefit, it's far too low, and that's why people are ending up more and more going into homelessness because of that particular situation. So we can do what we can. The Welsh government can do what it can, and hopefully we'll see a Plaid Cymru Welsh government elected next year. But we still have the limits of devolution in terms of some of the barriers that I'm talking about that we don't have levers of control over, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I know that one of the problems that your bill hopes to address is the millions, hundreds of millions, I think, that are spent on emergency accommodation. How do you break that cycle if you're going to sort of stop the emergency accommodation?
I think there's a number of issues. Obviously, since homelessness has gone up in every part of the UK at the moment. I think we've taken a number of actions. One is obviously working with 5 local authorities under most pressure. So there was £80 million we've set aside talking about acquisitions and voids. So how can we go out and purchase properties? How can we voids? Edinburgh, for example, had 1,500 voids. Far too many in terms of that. So we've obviously reduced the voids in Edinburgh from 1,500 to 500 within a number of months. I think there are far too many empty homes. Now, empty homes are slightly different from void properties. Empty homes are homes that are privately owned. So we've spent around about £3.7 million, which has brought 11,000 empty homes back in, but we need to be doing more in terms of that. Obviously, increasing the affordable housing budget in terms of that. So these are some of the actions that we are taking. Some of the other issues as well is there are additional pressures of those seeking asylum in Edinburgh and in Glasgow, and Scotland has been very welcoming in terms of doing that, and will continue to do so. But we need support from the UK government on that particular matter. We had a meeting with Scottish Refugee Council, Glasgow Council, and ourselves on that matter. The UK government decided not to even appear for the meeting in terms of that. There has to be funding that follows that. The UK government makes a decision about where they want to put those in asylum. We don't have any input into that whatsoever, and there is no funding that follows that. And I said Scotland will continue to welcome refugees. I want to make that point very strongly. Scotland will continue to welcome refugees. We have 25% of Ukrainian, of those who settled in Ukraine, in the UK, in Scotland, 25%. And I still have the I suppose the humility to speak to people who come in and actually thank us for doing that, and that's a very humbling experience. Just on Friday I was at an event and I had somebody come across and say that to me, so it's very humbling, and I'm very proud that we can do that. But the UK government needs to do more in terms of how they support us, whether it's through local housing allowance being increased, universal credit being increased, or working with us on the asylum issue to welcome more people into Scotland.
Thank you, Paul. And so good luck with the bill going through to stage 3. Hope it passes smoothly. Excuse me. The Scottish Government has thrown out the controversial plans to allow a harness trotting track near the historic site of the Battle of Bannockburn. Paul, I'm guessing that as a cabinet minister that you were part of the decision making for that, for Bannockburn. If so, just what was it like to be on that committee? You came down on the side of organisations like the National Trust for Scotland. Was it a quick and easy decision, or was it a tough and embattled one?
Brian, that'll be the position of obviously there'll be a recommendation goes to the planning minister on terms of that. So he would make the decision in that regard. So I wasn't involved in that discussion. I think being a councillor for 15 years and being a previous council leader, then you know the process, and planning can be complex, when it goes through the local authority, and then if it's called in or appealed to the Scottish Government, then obviously there'll be a decision recommended by the planner themselves, which will go to the minister. The minister then makes that final decision in terms of this. So I'm not aware and wasn't involved in the process in terms of that. But planning can be, as I said, it's a very complex area in terms of this. But that would have been the planning minister that would have made that final decision.
Okay, apologies, Paul. I was hoping for a bit of gossip there, but but fair enough. Mark, in case you're wondering, Bannockburn was where in June 1314 Robert the Bruce and his Scottish army, despite being outnumbered, famously defeated the English troops led by King Edward II. It's what the song Flower of Scotland is actually all about. So knowing that and having heard Paul's brief comments there, what are your thoughts on this piece?
Well, Brian, I definitely can't offer you any gossip here on this one, but I think it shows that we've got to protect our national assets, doesn't it? I think that's critical. And some of this concern that's being raised by people is because we're just disregarding them too much. And I think this is right that this gets considered at a higher level. I'm a councillor at the moment in the Vale of Glamorgan in my local ward, and planning is one of them. Probably the most contentious things that comes up, but everyone knows that. But really, it shouldn't. Planning considerations should really make sure that we maintain the access to historic places, so that people can understand why these things happened, when they happen, and have a bit of an understanding. And I'm not sure, just from as an outsider looking in, whether this proposal or previous proposals actually did that for this area. So I think it's the right thing that it gets called in. I wish I had some gossip to give you, but I haven't.
Okay, thank you. Paul, we've got about, say, 45 seconds left. Do you want to have maybe the final word on this topic, or is there anything else that you'd like to say?
No, I think in terms of what Mark says, that there are historic sites that I think that we should be looking to protect, and Bannockburn's a major part of Scotland's history, so it should always be part of a planning process. I think in terms of that, Mark will know as well that planning can be very emotive for people. I'm glad that the government made the decision that it made, even though I didn't have any input into it, but I'm glad the decision was made in terms of that. And we have to protect our sites of heritage. There is no doubt around about that. But planning can be very emotive. But I'm glad on this case that decision was made.
Does this say anything about Stirling Council and the fact that they were willing to let it go ahead? And did maybe the people of Stirling have a campaign to change it?
I think in terms of planning, I think if an application comes forward, it has to be assessed on material planning considerations, and we know that. Whether that's in terms of amenity, whether that's in terms of noise, there has to be the material planning considerations. One of the key things then is making sure right at the outset, in terms of policy, that protecting sites of heritage are incredibly important in that. So any decision that's made is based on policy, not just because we think it's the wrong decision, but it has to be based on policy. So I think in how we protect our heritage sites needs to be part of planning policy as we go ahead. And I think that's one of the key things, I think, in terms of that. We need to protect heritage. It's an incredibly important part of Scotland's history and needs to continue to be so.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish, but before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on your generosity to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment. We thank you very much. Our costs are around £4,000 monthly, and we tend to receive about £2,500 in donations every month. We have raised over £10,500 this year so far, but that's £14,000 less than we need to be on target and to be able to pay our bills, which we urgently need to be able to do. So we need to raise that £14,000 as pretty much immediately. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, or please just donate whatever you can afford. So thank you again to our guests, to Paul McLennan and to Mark Hooper. Thank you for taking a huge chunk of your weekend out for both of you. Paul, good luck with your housing bill, and Mark, good luck with your campaign for the Senate. So that's it for this week. So goodbye, and thank you to you at home for watching.